Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to start a new series, and it's going to be on the interactions between Jesus and the Pharisees in the four Gospels. Some time ago I did a series called Development Theories of the Gospels Are All Bunk. I believe that was the exact wording of the series title. And I'm going to be adding these to that same playlist because I am once again arguing that a particular development theory of the Gospels is in fact bunk, that it's just complete nonsense. A development theory of the Gospels is some sort of idea that you can line the Gospels up in order with they're becoming gradually more and more changed, okay, where they're adding things or changing things as they get later chronologically, so that then John would be the most factually changed because he's the latest, and then whatever order the person thinks the others are in. Mark is often taken to be the first, so Mark would be the least changed, but then it would get more and more something or other as you go on chronologically to later Gospels. So I've talked about the claim that the Gospels get more and more anti-Semitic, is one claim. I've talked about the claim that I think I did one on whether the Gospels resurrection narratives get progressively more impressive or more developed appearing or something like that. Okay, so you get the idea of what a development theory is. In this particular case, the development theory in question is that as you get later chronologically throughout the Gospels in their order of writing, Jesus engages more with the Pharisees, so that the Pharisees become the bad guys more and more as you go in order of chronological writing, because the later a gospel is written, so goes the theory, the more conflict there was between the Christians of that time when it was written, as opposed to the time when the events supposedly actually took place, and the rabbinic Jews, particularly after the fall of Jerusalem, when rabbinic Judaism really grew because there was no more temple sacrifice system going on. And so then those rabbinic leaders were sort of the heirs of the Pharisees, and then the idea is that the gospel authors showed Jesus as being in more conflict with the Pharisees because their own immediate audiences were being persecuted by or in conflict with the heirs of the Pharisees, the rabbis, and so forth. And so this would make it sort of more, as we might say, relatable to their audiences for them to make, counterfactually, contrary to fact, make Jesus have more conflicts with the Pharisees than in fact he actually had, even changing sometimes the people he was interacting with who really weren't Pharisees into Pharisees, because then that would be more interesting to their audiences or be somehow helpful to their audiences. Their audiences would feel like Jesus' story applied to them more. All right, that's the development theory in question. And the order that I'll be talking about is the order advocated by, I'm sorry to say, Craig Keener, conservative labeled scholar, and in some ways relatively conservative scholar, Craig Keener. His order, his proposed order, is that supposedly Mark and Luke have the least engagement with Pharisaism, and then Matthew has more engagement with Pharisaism, and then John has the most, and he even uses this, as you'll see in the first quote I'm going to read here, as an argument that Matthew was written after the fall of Jerusalem. And he's implying after Luke, because supposedly Matthew has more engagement with Pharisaism than Luke does. Okay, so I'm going to read quotes. Today I'm just introducing this series, I'm going to read quotations from Dr. Keener's commentaries on Matthew and on John to document that this is in fact his theory, and then I'll just give you a little preview of how the rest of the series is going to go. So I want to start with his Matthew commentary, page 68. He's talking about the dating of Matthew. When was Matthew written? The following evidence seems to favor a date after AD 70. And then I'm just going to read you one of the pieces of evidence because that's the one related to my topic. 1, more than Mark or Luke, but much less exclusively than John, who writes in the 90s, Matthew particularly engages Pharisaism, which became a dominant element in early Syro-Palestinian Christians' primary opposition, mainly after 70. Indeed, Pharisees may have been much less hostile toward law-keeping Jewish Christians in the 60s. Okay, so what he's saying is the Pharisees only became a primary opponents to the Christians after the fall of Jerusalem. And Matthew, quote unquote, engages Pharisaism more than Luke or Mark, and that this is an argument that Matthew was writing after the fall of Jerusalem. All right, now to document that this is definitely a fact-changing theory, I'm going to be reading some quotes from Keener's John commentary. Later in this series, I'll be reading a little bit more about what he has to say about Matthew and Matthew's supposed redaction of Q, because I've got enough quotes to read for today. But the idea, which we'll discuss later, is that supposedly he can tell what Q said, even though we don't have Q, and that Matthew changed what Q said without factual basis in order to engage Pharisaism more. All right. So I'm going to now go to some quotations from the John commentary. This first one is from page 184. The Pharisees and Jewish Christians probably had a more amicable relationship in the 60s, but some factors surrounding the Judean revolt seem to have changed the relationship to what appears presupposed in Matthew and John. All right, so the Judean revolt was in the 60s, of course, well after the actual ministry of Jesus. So, in other words, the relationship between Jesus and the Pharisees, which is quote-unquote presupposed in Matthew and John, is not the historical relationship in Jesus' ministry. Rather, it's a relationship that only came into being caused by factors surrounding the Judean revolt, which was decades after the life of Jesus. That's pretty striking. Seems to have changed the relationship to what appears presupposed in Matthew and John. But Matthew and John are talking about stuff that supposedly happened in Jesus' ministry. Okay? Matthew and John are not, like explicitly talking, hey, you, my audience, that they're not epistles, like Paul's epistle, that specifically speaks directly of the circumstances surrounding the authorship of the work. Rather, when he talks about the relationship presupposed in Matthew and John, he's talking about presupposed in incidents that supposedly really happened in Jesus' lifetime, even if the Gospels themselves are written later. Okay, so that's interesting. All right, now here we go to more in the John commentary, pages 430 to 433. The Gospels Jews, little preface here. He's talking about John the Baptist, the ministry of John the Baptist, in a passage in John 1, where it says that the Pharisees sent some people to ask John the Baptist who he was, and to kind of inquire, are you the Messiah, etc. Okay, and why are you baptizing, and kind of, stick their noses in. Okay, and it says that they were priests and Levites, and that they were from or out of, it's just ek, is the word, the Pharisees. So, some of the ones who came could themselves have been Pharisees, but in any event, they're from the Pharisees. All right, and he's questioning the historicity of this. And it really, emphasizes that they say, well, we have to have some answer to give to those who have sent us. And I'll be coming back to this in a later video where I try to talk about, what is Keener's argument, because we're going to see that the actual data of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John just do not support this developmental thesis at all, to the point that you're going to start wondering, like, why in the world would he say this? Well, this passage in John 1 is apparently one of his primary arguments, and what I'm about to read to you is one of the places where he makes this argument. We'll be diving into it even more in a later video. Okay, here we go. The Gospels Jews who set the priests and Levites, 119, were Pharisees, 124. Now he means the Gospel says they were Pharisees, but he doesn't really think they were Pharisees. But early first century Pharisees as a group did not exercise authority over priests and Levites. See also comment on 732. We'll talk about that in a minute. That's John 7:32. All right, exercise authority, like they had to exercise authority and send them and make them go. Okay, this is not to suggest that John reports no historical tradition here. He clearly does depend on some prior tradition, parenthesis, Luke 3:15. Now, sure as God made little green apples, if somebody gets offended that I'm daring to critique Dr. Keener, because I know, he's greatly respected, I respect his learning, his learnedness and so forth, but I just don't think he's making a good argument here. When people get offended, they'll often try to pretend that something's being taken out of context, even though it's not. So, hey, he says John doesn't report historical tradition, so Lydia's just misrepresenting him. Yeah, but the alleged historical tradition, Luke 3:15, it's not about this incident. This incident is unique to John. No other gospel reports this incident where the rulers representatives of the rulers come and talk to John the Baptist and ask him who he is. It's only in John. What happens in Luke 3:15 is that the people are wondering who John the Baptist is, and in fact, in a passage I'm not going to read today, in Keener's commentary, he literally tries to set Luke against John, and it's like, but Luke says that this question was the question of the crowd, as if it couldn't be the question of both the crowd and the leaders. Kind of a crazy argument. So if the only tradition that lies behind what John is talking about is what's in Luke 3:15, then John is making stuff up. He's making an entire incident up. All right. But the role of the Pharisees suggests that he couches his tradition in language relevant for his audience. This isn't just going to be about language. That is a euphemism for making up facts. The Pharisees, he continues a bit later, hardly controlled the priests of Jesus' day, whereas some successors of the Pharisees appeared to have been gaining an increasingly dominant role in the Palestinian Judaism of the Fourth Gospel's day. So now we're exaggerating it to the claim that they controlled the priests, okay? The Pharisees as a whole controlled the priests as a whole, which is much stronger than what John says. But see what he's doing. He's saying, well, Pharisees later had more power when John was writing. Okay. Like other early Christian writers who adapted the original form of Jesus' divorce logion to different contexts, e.g., Roman law in Mark, or like Qumran's interpreters applying the sense of biblical texts directly to their own generation, the writer of the fourth gospel updates his language to speak directly to the hearers of his day. So you'll notice the assumption that Mark has changed Jesus' divorce logion to apply to Roman law. It's very questionable. I don't think Mark did anything of the kind. I also don't think Matthew did anything of the kind. I think they just report what Jesus said. But so he's taking that as a given, okay? updates his language. Okay, now, again, what he's saying is that the Pharisees did not have the authority to send any messengers who were priests and Levites. The priests and Levites as a whole were totally above the Pharisees. There wouldn't have been a historical situation where they were from the Pharisees, where priests and Levites were coming from Pharisees. And so therefore, it didn't happen. Okay, and that John is making it be that Pharisees sent priests and Levites. Some Pharisees sent out some priests and Levites to ask John the Baptist why he was baptizing, contrary to fact. But he's calling this updating his language. That is a misleading euphemism because it's changing the fact. I'm sorry, priests and Levites are different groups from Pharisees. All right. John, who prefers to emphasize the authority of the Pharisees, he puts that in scare quotes, more than Matthew and far more than Mark or Luke, probably because he writes at a period when their authority was far more advanced and hostile to Palestinian Jewish Christians. So there we are again. Because he's writing at a later period, he's trying to make it look like they had more authority than they really did. Nowhere else mentions priests and Levites. One might suggest, and he is suggesting, that the fourth gospel generally transforms the priestly leaders in traditional sources, meaning historical sources, into Pharisees, leaders whose role in repressing minority factions in John's day corresponded to aristocratic priests in Jesus' day. Now, that's pretty darned clear, and this is the John commentary, pages 430 to 433. He's transforming priestly leaders into Pharisees. He's changing people who weren't Pharisees into Pharisees because the Pharisees' role in repressing the Christians in John's day corresponded to a repressive role, of repressing or oppressing Jesus in Jesus' day. So John's changing what really happened. Okay. And then my last quotation that I'm going to read. All right. This concerns John 7:32, where it says that the priests, the chief priests, and the Pharisees, so there John has them supposedly working together, sent the temple guard to try to arrest Jesus in John 7. And then the temple guard, they don't arrest Jesus. And they said, we've never heard anybody speak like this before. All right, so listen to this. Keener's comment on this. The prominence of chief priests in the passage has been explained in various ways, but fits accurately what we know of Jerusalem's ruling class before 70 CE. Okay, so he'll pass the chief priests as, yeah, that's probably historical. That fits accurately with what we know. That the Pharisees and chief priests would join one another in sending officers. However, and by the way, he cites here John 18:3, which also says that the Pharisees were involved in sending out the people to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. However, attributes to the Pharisees more political power than they were known to have in Jesus' day. It probably reflects John's own historical situation, in which Pharisees had achieved greater dominance among the Judean religious elite. That's the John commentary, page 720. Once again, it couldn't be much clearer that the involvement of the chief priests, well, that was probably historical, but that it's unlikely that it was the chief priests coordinating with the Pharisees to send the temple guard to arrest Jesus, because that they had too much. That would show them as having too much power. They didn't really have that power to work with the chief priest to try to get Jesus arrested. So it's probably a non-factual, though he doesn't use that word, insertion that reflects John's own traditional situation in which the Pharisees had achieved greater dominance. All right, so it's a fact-changing development theory. Once again, to review, it's supposed to be Mark and Luke, then Matthew, then John. More and more engagement with Pharisaism to make their readers feel seen in the modern jargon, make them feel like the stories relate to them. Now, in the weeks that follow here, I'm going to be examining this from all kinds of different angles to just show how spectacularly this thesis is wrong and is inaccurate in describing the actual data of the Gospels. It's just astounding how wrong it is. And Keener's emphasizing like a couple of data points which provide only very weak evidence. Often it's what you might call a priori history, as here, I don't think the Pharisees had that much power. So very weak, but not only that, even those data points are just overwhelmed by a mass of other data points in which Luke is at least as negative about the Pharisees as Matthew is, if not more so, and the Synoptics as a whole emphasize the Pharisees persecuting Jesus and coming after Jesus and bothering him way more often than John does. So it's just crazy. It fails at every point. I'll be examining conflicts over the Pharisees' rules, like keeping the Sabbath, washing your hands, etc. Way more of those in the Synoptics than in John, and actually even more of them in Luke than in Matthew. Now, I'm not saying that means Luke was later than Matthew. I just think this whole developmental approach is just wrong. Okay, but anyway, the data of controversies over rules do not support this thesis. They strongly undermine this developmental thesis. How about what I'm going to call rants against the Pharisees? So directly negative comments directed at the Pharisees by Jesus, by John the Baptist, by or even by the narrator in some cases. All right, do not fit this pattern. I'm going to talk about attempts to trap Jesus with questions. Okay, attempts to say, hey, what about this, And then Jesus is always ready, for those questions. Those kinds of attempts to trap Jesus, they're in the Synoptics. There actually isn't a case in John where it says that they were coming to him and they had some kind of tricksy question, and the Pharisees were trying to entrap him with a question. So, that doesn't fit. I'm going to talk about this claim that John exclusively focuses on the Pharisees to the exclusion of other groups. That doesn't fit the data either. In fact, one of the things we just talked about in John 7, it's the chief priests and the Pharisees working together. So he's not talking about the Pharisees to the exclusion of some other group. So that's not true either. That doesn't match it either. I'm bringing that up because of his less exclusively phrase in the first quote that I read. And I'm even going to just have a miscellaneous section where I'm like, okay, here's some miscellaneous negative things about the Pharisees, and how does this all come together to give a picture of who engages with Pharisaism the most. I would say by a narrow margin, it's probably Luke. But Luke is right in there with Matthew and Mark. They're all really similar, and I don't think anybody should try to make anything of that. But by a very large margin, Luke over John. So the entire development thesis, when we just get down to counting incidents of negative comments about Pharisees, Pharisees bothering Jesus, Pharisees persecuting Jesus, controversies between Jesus and the Pharisees, it's just massively contrary to Keener's thesis. And this is the kind of research that I think really needs to be done, because otherwise when you read this, it just turns into a kind of urban legend. one person says it, somebody else copies it, somebody else says, oh, those guys both say it, so I'm going to say it. And it takes kind of sometimes an outsider to come along and say, is that really true? Let's go and actually count. Let's go. Wait, this doesn't seem right to me. And I remember years ago, I don't even remember why exactly I was reading that part of Kinner's Matthew commentary. I think I wanted to see what he said about the dating of Matthew. And I read that, and I said, that doesn't sound right. There's way more stuff about the authority of the Pharisees in the Synoptics than there is in John. Like, what? So I went and began to do this research then, and then recently I stumbled across it again, and in preparation for this series did even more research along these lines. So I'm going to make that available to you. This is exclusive to my YouTube channel and my podcast. This content, as far as I can recall, is not in any of my books, not in any of my other published works. So be sure to click like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.